in a very dynamic way, with a crescendo and with the voice moving up still higher.
But brave at last with bugles and a bisected coach, it bears away in triumph.
So as you can hear, this section climaxes musically on the word triumph, and what I've tried to do here is elucidate and augment the literary meaning of the poem, which, as in so much of Emily Dickinson, is that death always, as she says, wins at last.
The music, of course, extends the meaning of the poem far beyond the literary expression.
And then the very end of the poem is a return, musically speaking, to the music of the beginning.
To troth unknown and kindred as responsive as porcelain.
The last section, for instance, is a good example of fitting poetry into a repetition of musical form. Dickinson's words here are quite different rhythmically at the end of the poem from those at the beginning, yet by shifting their position in relation to this music, this basic accompaniment figure, they fit.
Bob, before we approach your setting of Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is really quite complex, could we talk about three things which determine a composer's or any artist's activity? Namely, the societal influence, secondly, the personality or personal predilections of the artist, and thirdly, the professional skill or the appropriateness of the interaction, in your case, of word and music.
Sure. First, let me say that generally this music, my music, when I deal with poetry, is dictated by the poetry. In other words, I don't just pour the poetry into a preconceived musical idea. A composer writes according to the material at hand.
It seems to me that the frantic, quick pace of contemporary society is reflected in the introduction to your setting of Because I Could Not Stop for Death.
Well, yes, I guess you're referring to this.
Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves.
But there are also literary justifications for what you do with the first stanza of that poem. It's clear that the speaker of the poem is moving quickly and strongly. In fact, moving with so much intent or speed that she could not stop, even for this all-powerful gentleman Death. It is he who must stop kindly for her.
Yes.
And as we move into the second and contrastive portion of your song, your setting of the poem, there is an abrupt change in the musical setting. Might this second musical idea be an example of the professional skill or the appropriateness of the use of elements that the professional makes?
Well, I would hope so. In the fourth line of this poem, Dickinson introduces the idea of immortality, clearly a very important idea for her and for all of us. It seems like immortality stops this frantic movement towards death. She does separate the concepts of death and immortality. The idea of life after death is a rather ghostly one in nature to many of us. So I used a second musical idea. I made the accompaniment of the voice very heavy, very deliberate. But the voice itself must explore the high range, and in particular I asked the singer to use falsetto, which has an eerie quality in the upper register. It goes something like this.
And immortality
And that eeriness, that spookiness comes from these very low chords here, combined with the thin, light quality of the voice in falsetto. You know, in music, the distance between the notes, what we call an interval in music, can have a very profound effect.
Bob, the third musical idea, again, another contrast in your setting of this poem, reflects, I think, your personal attraction to Emily Dickinson's humor, although you do it in a highly individual way.
Well, she says, "We slowly drove, he knew no haste." And this suggested somewhat of a dance to me. And so we have Death appearing perhaps in tie and tails, and the character in a ball gown, and they dance.
We slowly drove, he knew no haste.
Interesting to me, Bob, that Emily Dickinson would personify death as a gentleman caller, a suitor, perhaps even a lover.
And a very complex one at that.
As you portray him, yes. Thank you, Robert Chauls.
Thank you, Bill.
Finally, Emily Dickinson has, I believe, given us her unique answer to the huge question of immortality. Immortality is found in the search for truth in art and in the expression of love. In her 20s, she wrote in a letter to a friend, "Love is my business," but her profession was poetry. She reaches out lovingly to us through that poetry. That poetry was her search for truth and is her immortality.